Welcome to Swing State. I am your host, Fox 8 senior political reporter Bob Buckley. Now, last week we had the Republican nominee for Attorney General, and today we have his counterpart, the Democratic nominee, former state senator and current Congressman Jeff Jackson. We appreciate you coming in.
Good to see you.
Yeah, you're a busy guy. I mean, this is not your only gig, being a member of Congress.
I'm still serving in the National Guard. I'm a major, and I got drill tomorrow. I got my uniform hanging up in my car. I'm talking to you on my way there.
We appreciate you making time. Now, you grew up down the road, Chapel Hill, but chose to get out of state. I kind of get it. Growing up in a town, you don't necessarily want to go to college in that town.
That's right. I grew up in Chapel Hill.
Yeah.
I wanted to get out of town for a little while, but I came back for law school, did UNC Chapel Hill.
But Emory for college in outside Atlanta, essentially.
Yep.
Majored in philosophy. You don't see that a lot.
Haven't made a buck off it yet.
Yeah.
All my philosophy work has been strictly pro bono.
Okay. You know, I had a buddy who double major philosophy in broadcasting in college so that he could wonder out loud. Do we have a rim shot in the audio booth there? Before you did that, though, you joined the Army Reserves as you turned 19. By the way, happy birthday.
Thanks.
September 12th, right after 9/11. What was behind that? I mean, was it a instantaneous, I need to go do this, or was it more of a process to get there?
It was a bit of a process. I had never considered enlisting before. As soon as September 11th struck, I started thinking about that and started talking to a recruiter shortly thereafter. Wanted to be able to join without dropping out of college, so they were able to stagger my training. So I did basic training after one summer and then graduated and then finished my training at Fort Bragg.
So as you started, though, you couldn't have been an officer because you didn't have a degree.
I enlisted as a private. I remember the recruiter told me, she said, because you've got some college, you're going to be a private first class. And I said, all right.
That was a big deal. But obviously after you finished, so you were not a judge advocate general when you went in?
No.
But you did that later when you deployed, right?
Well, after I came back from Afghanistan, then I went to law school. But in Afghanistan, I was a corporal.
Okay. What made you run for state senate, your first elective office? I think it was about 10 years ago, right?
It wasn't a plan. I was at the district attorney's office and I had been there for several years, enjoyed it, was going to continue, and then at the end of court one day, this defense attorney said, Jeff, did you hear the news? I said, no, what happened? He said, the mayor of Charlotte was just arrested by the FBI.
Oh my.
For taking bribes from undercover FBI agents. And I said, well, that's amazing. And I just went on about my day. I didn't think it was going to have anything to do with me.
Okay.
The mayor stepped down the next day. They picked my state senator to become the new mayor. And then pretty much out of the blue, I got picked to replace him. Had never run for office, didn't know anyone who had run for office, was 31 years old, which was half the average age of the state senate. Last time I had been there was on the 3rd grade field trip.
Wow. Learning curve?
An enormous learning curve. Yeah, absolutely. I was meeting people that I'd only read about in the newspaper. That was the first time I had experienced that.
Okay, so you then looked to upgrade to the U.S. Senate 2 years ago and ended up leaving that race and endorsing your fellow Democrat, Cheri Beasley. What was behind that? Both choosing to run and then deciding that you'd step aside.
Well, choosing to run, I just thought that it was a moment for our nation where I thought I had something to offer on that level, and I wanted to make it a 100-county campaign. I had this vision in my head of going to every county and holding an open town hall where anyone could come and ask any question. And so we did it. We did every single county, and then we started a college tour. We went to a bunch of different colleges. It was an amazing education, but it was pretty clear to me that Cheri Beasley was going to win the primary. I thought the right thing to do was step aside and endorse her.
But then you transitioned into a U.S. House race that you won and have spent the last 2 years in Congress. Is redistricting the reason you're leaving that job?
That's part of it. I mean, we saw coming that I was probably going to be gerrymandered out of the seat. I started thinking about if there's something else that I wanted to do. Attorney General, it became very clear to me that this would be the most important public service opportunity of my lifetime, and I feel really good about the campaign we've run so far.
Well, I'd say a lot of people believe that the AG is, if not the second most powerful, close to the second most influential office in the state. Let me stay on that subject for a minute, though, running for Congress again. The district was what they call a D2, meaning that a generic Democrat should win it by 2 points, 2 percentage points. You won with 58, so you were getting support beyond traditional Democrat support, but it still wasn't enough for you to stay in that race?
The way it was redrawn, it is completely impossible for the other party to win. It's I was completely nuked.
All right. You got a lot of attention through your use of TikTok, being a younger guy, 42 now. It was still effective? It was still something you use?
Well, I use 8 different social media platforms. I just do one little video every week where I tell people, here's the most interesting thing that happened to me as the new guy in Congress. And I post it to Facebook and Twitter and every place. TikTok is what gets the most views these days because that's just where most people are.
But speaking of that, though, you did, and everyone knows this, I suppose, people who pay attention to these things, it's not a secret. You voted for the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act, which essentially says the president can declare a service or an application to be a danger to the U.S. and essentially ban it. So you've used it. You still use it, though, right?
I do. I don't think it should be banned. The whole purpose of the bill was to force a sale. It was a divestment.
Right.
It would just be a better app if we don't have to worry about the national security concerns that come from the fact that China owns it.
Is it going to be sold? Because I've seen that, and I've heard certain venture capitalists say, I'd buy it in a heartbeat. And they say would part of the legislation be they have to completely redo the algorithms and the software so that China can't get.
It's very simple. It says anybody can own TikTok except China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela.
But they'd have to reconfigure it, wouldn't they? Because you don't want China to have left backdoors ways into this to get the data they want.
That's a fair point, yeah.
Yeah. But that's not in that legislation that
No.
you remember? All right. 25 states have automatic voter registration when individuals interact with the DMV. This is not one of them. North Carolina is not one of them. But it's leading to what we're finding are thousands of non-citizens on voter rolls. You would be the chief law enforcement officer in the state if you win this election. Is that a concern at all?
Well, anytime you have non-citizens on voter rolls, yes, that is a concern. That said, automatic voter registration has proven to be a really effective way to increase people's registration. If there are protections we need to add to make sure that non-citizens aren't being added, I'm all for it. Let's look for the gold standard way to do this.
Okay. You feel good about North Carolina's voter rolls, what you know about them right now?
Yes.
All right, because there hasn't been the purge, as they call them here. But most states are required by law to go through these things every, 3-5 years. You know, I mean, do you believe in the idea of going through the voter rolls to see who's on there?
I don't think there's any problem with taking a look at voter rolls and making sure only people who are allowed to vote are on the voter rolls. That said, everybody's worried about shenanigans with respect to these voter rolls.
Yes.
It's an extremely sensitive issue because we have seen, for lack of a better word, shenanigans with respect to voter rolls.
That's a great word my Irish grandmother would use often. A lot more still to talk about, including what an attorney general can and should do about gun violence and the fentanyl crisis. Welcome back to Swing State. Tonight we are talking to Democratic nominee for Attorney General Jeff Jackson. And you know, we were just mentioning before we went to break, one of the biggest issues for you, and I think for so many North Carolinians, is the fentanyl crisis. What should the chief law enforcement officer of this state, which you would be if you win this election, do about the fentanyl crisis?
Like any big problem, you start by breaking it into pieces.
Okay.
I think the two big pieces here are supply and demand. The focus on supply is about identifying the distribution cells that exist within our state. General Assembly did something helpful a few months ago. They gave us an anti-money laundering law. North Carolina was a state that didn't have one. Goes into effect in December. I would be the first Attorney General who had that tool. Very effective for investigations, prosecutions, and for aiding coordination with federal law enforcement, all in aid of identifying and breaking apart these distribution cells across the state.
Because they're really no different. This is sort of like the old racketeering laws,
Yes.
right? It's like battling the mafia, which is essentially what these are.
Which is exactly what these are. This is a type of organized crime. That's supply side. Demand side, that's the addiction conversation. It's important people understand the gold standard for treating fentanyl addiction is medicated assisted because the hardcore users, the addicts, they're not using fentanyl to get high. They haven't gotten high in years. They're using it to stave off withdrawal. Fentanyl withdrawal is especially heinous, which is why you need medicated approach to get through or you'll have a relapse. About a third of our counties doing a good job using that gold standard approach. My job, help the other two-thirds.
How much would it depend, your ability to fight this, what's done at the border, though? I mean, the border's a mess.
Yes, the border's a mess. And there's been some bipartisan legislation that would put fentanyl scanners at the border. It's hard because fentanyl is so much more potent than heroin.
Yeah.
A smaller amount can be trafficked through the border. It's coming through mainly through legal points of entry, mainly by American drug dealers.
But we did see recently the federal government confirmed more than 400 members of this Venezuelan gang were captured at the border and released into this country. At least 400.
It's incredibly frustrating. This is the most frustrating issue that I've dealt with in Congress because there's a huge bipartisan consensus for how to deal with this. I think there probably has been for a few years, and the reason it didn't happen was because some folks decided they wanted the issue for the campaigns.
Well, let me push back a little bit on that, because I've heard some of the folks who voted against the bill that Kathy Manning, who sat in that chair a couple of months ago, brought up were two things. One, that it focused mostly on processing and giving legal status to these people rather than sending them back to where they came from too often. And it set up what they felt was an unconstitutional set of courts in the executive branch to adjudicate all these cases, when that should be not an executive branch function.
I'm fine with any criticism that people have, but the telltale sign on this is that when it came over to the House, or didn't even come over to the House, the House didn't even try. They didn't have any hearings. All the committee structure that's there, the issues that you just listed, they didn't say, well, let's improve those. They took the Senate bill and they threw it in the trash because they couldn't risk solving the problem because they need the problem for their campaigns.
Senator Till has claimed that Chuck Schumer wouldn't allow any amendments, but that's not your side of the Congress.
The House is right there. We've got all these committees. Let's take what they did and let's solve the things they say are problems. They didn't even try because they didn't want to solve the problem.
You advocate for universal background checks on guns. What would that include, and who would not be able to get guns? And I know you'd go back and forth with the legislature, but what would you like to see?
It's just current law as to who doesn't get guns. For instance, people convicted of violent crimes wouldn't be able to get guns. If we want to make sure that people convicted of violent crimes aren't getting guns, you have to have universal background checks.
What type of waiting period would be in that? For example, there may be cases where women who have men, exes, in some cases who want to do serious harm to them, can't wait weeks or months. How long do these background checks take?
Well, the current background, I don't know exactly how many days the current background checks take, but I will say with respect to the big loophole we have, it has to do usually with gun shows or things that are not, guns that are not being sold at a gun dealership, at an existing established point of sale.
You know, the other side of the political spectrum often says essentially, show me a case where there's strict gun laws where violence isn't high. You know, the old idea of the criminals by definition don't care about the law, they do what they want to do.
Yeah, I understand. We're going to have a certain level of gun violence despite best efforts, but do the obvious stuff, do the common sense stuff. Can we all agree that people convicted of violent crimes shouldn't be able to purchase guns? If so, then you have to make sure we have background checks in place. That's not controversial.
Is that the main thing? If you have violent conviction for some violence in the background,
I think that's the main thing. Yeah.
What about some mental health issues?
If a court has adjudicated that and there's due process in place, sure.
Because we've had a hard time, since the 70s, there were two in particular Supreme Court decisions that made it very difficult to involuntarily put someone in mental health care.
Yes.
And that's when, as you pointed out, our prisons too often become our mental health facilities, which is an awful thing to put them in. They're not prepared for that.
No, that's true. As we decrease funding for mental health, we have to increase funding for incarceration, and that's not what we should be doing.
Is the biggest challenge to denying someone a right, though, the fact that it's right there in the Second Amendment?
It's not about denying a right. Make sure they are provided due process. They will have a right to due process.
Okay. You know, the father of the student who killed the 4 people at the high school in Georgia recently was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter and second-degree murder, to quote the legal paperwork, for knowingly allowing his son to possess a weapon. Do you think we're going to see more of this?
I don't know. If the facts are there, then yes. I'm a former prosecutor. I'm a big, let's look at the facts first kind of guy.
But if you see the fact that, what would be the standard? Because we saw it in Michigan was the first case we saw it, where the kid who shot up things there.
True.
Those parents were, I think, by any reasonable person's definition, negligent, and just essentially turned the blind eye to what they knew was a bad situation.
You know, what I'll say is it's going to take an egregious set of facts for your average jury to convict under those circumstances. However, in Michigan, we had an egregious set of facts. We may have one in Georgia as well.
Yeah, all right. Well, one of the very big, actually, we still got a little more time before we go, so let me hit on one other thing I want to hit on here. Sorry, I misread my clock. There's a movement across the country to not prosecute entire classes of crimes. We saw the district attorneys in major cities, LA, San Francisco, Chicago, Baltimore, Boston, St. Louis, all say that they won't prosecute most misdemeanors, and many of them are pushing to eliminate cash bail. Is that a good idea?
You can't say that you're not going to prosecute a certain category of crime. You can appeal to the General Assembly and say we need to make changes to the statute here, but no, as a prosecutor, you can't say I'm going to, despite the fact that these laws remain on the books, I'm going to refuse to prosecute an entire category of crime.
So you would, as Attorney General here, you would, of course, the district, you don't prosecute as an AG.
You're involved in the chain of prosecution because you end up handling the appeals, but you are not the line prosecutor for cases, except in special cases where there's a conflict of interest.
Okay, one very big issue still to come. When can and should an Attorney General say no to doing his job? That's next. Welcome back. A little more time here with the Democratic nominee for Attorney General Jeff Jackson, currently serving in Congress, former state senator. I wanted to bring up this idea that starting during the pandemic in 2021, a series of major law enforcement agencies, more than a third of them, including LA, Chicago, New York, stopped reporting their crime statistics, allowing some elected officials to claim the crime is down. Of course, we don't know. How do we know what our problem is, what our level of crime is, if we're not getting statistics?
That's wrong. Report your statistics. We should at least have the data so we know what the situation is.
I mean, is your sense, again, as you're running, being the chief law enforcement officer of the state, is your sense that crime is down?
Except with respect to juvenile crime, I wouldn't say crime is down, but juvenile crime is the big reason why crime is up. That's where we're seeing a big spike, particularly with larceny, stolen vehicles.
Where's it coming from, do you think? This increase in juvenile crime?
Oh, you mean why has there been an increase
what's the cause
in juvenile crime? It may be somewhat tangentially related to the pandemic. We saw a rise in crime during the pandemic. There are also these wild trends that take off online about challenging young people to steal Kias or Hyundais. When you ask local law enforcement leadership in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area what would help here, they say we need more options for young people, places to go after school where they'll be safe, YMCA programs, that type of thing.
Why don't we talk more about, and so many candidates who sat in that chair have heard this from me. If you look at the statistics, nothing correlates to either bad behavior or good behavior than whether families are intact, fathers are there. And they don't have to live in the same household, although that's obviously the best ideal situation. But when fathers no longer involved with their kids, the trouble those kids get into, both boys and girls, just skyrockets. No one wants to talk about a father's responsibility to their kids.
You know, a father does have responsibility to their kids. I got 3 kids. I would like to be an attorney general who talks about early childhood education. These kids get the short end of the stick every budget making season because they don't vote and they don't protest. And when you give them only 1% of the budget, they don't know to complain. I'd like to be an attorney general who helps voters connect the dots between failing to support these working families and very young children and the prison population in our state. Of course there's a connection. 0 to 8 is the literacy bridge. These kids don't get across by the age of 8, they never get across.
There is that challenge, but also we've seen that with extremely rare, very expensive Cadillac small operations, the early childhood education stuff, the advantage the kids get disappears by 3rd grade.
Well, sometimes not. If
Almost exclusively.
If it's high quality, we've seen really good results. By the way, North Carolina, first southern state to have universal kindergarten. Nobody says that was a bad idea.
What I'm saying, though, is people keep saying, well, isn't it obvious that early childhood education, preschool, all that stuff works? And we don't know that it works because the academic, at least the academic advantages disappear in 2 to 3 years unless you've got, again, that extremely expensive, extremely small. It's not scalable is what the opponents would say.
I would agree that we don't have it all figured out when it comes to early childhood. And it is easy to exaggerate, but there's no way we're going to solve the literacy problem that we have unless we figure this out.
Unlike in the federal government where the Attorney General works at the pleasure of the President, in North Carolina, that's not the case. It's a separate office. The governor doesn't control you, that position. In 2008, California's Attorney General, then Jerry Brown, refused to defend Proposition 8, which defined marriage as a legal bond between one man and one woman. That kind of started a trend. That was the first time it happened. And then here, Governor Roy Cooper took that position with HB 2 in 2016, said, we won't defend this. Do you agree with people elected to defend the state's laws, picking and choosing which ones to defend?
You can't pick and choose. It is an obligation of the Attorney General to represent the state,
Right.
but you swear an oath to the state and federal constitution. So there is an outer limit for what you are able to do. If there's a good faith belief that there's a clear constitutional violation, and I think I've heard my opponent basically make the same formulation, under those circumstances, your oath is to the Constitution.
Well, I asked specifically last week in that chair, I said to Dan Bishop, you know, because he had said he was pro-life, and he confirmed that on this program. And I said, would you defend a right to an abortion in the state if that's the state law? And he said he would, even though he feels it's blatantly wrong. Now, the idea of is it constitutional?
Yeah, but it's not it wouldn't be
But
unconstitutional.
isn't that what the whole process is for? To determine, it's not the Attorney General to determine if it's constitutional.
Well,
it's
it's
for
also-
the judges.
It's also not the General Assembly, and which is why, it's a fair point,
Yeah.
you have to reserve that for extremely rare cases where it's very clear. I think Roy Cooper was right in that decision. I think Josh was right in his decision as well.
So if the state this North Carolina decided abortion was going to be banned, period, and the suits would of course come, and you're Attorney General, would you defend the state?
No, I think that would be unconstitutional.
Okay. But again, that's not for the AG to decide.
It is for the AG to decide in the situation where there is a clear constitutional violation. Has to be very rare. This isn't something that can be done very often.
What does it violate, though?
Well,
Because the abortion's not in either the state or the federal constitution.
well, let's take that when it comes.
Okay.
I think it's extremely unlikely. Let's take it when it
Well,
comes.
I do too. And people keep saying former President Trump is trying to ban abortion. He's on the record multiple times this campaign saying he would not sign an abortion ban, and he criticized Florida for their abortion ban being too strict.
Until he said the next day that he was going to vote for it. Look, Trump has been on every side of this issue.
Should our law enforcement cooperate with the immigration police, essentially ICE, to keep us safer?
I think they're working out a deal right now that's going to balance all of the interests. I think we're going to see final text on this within the next few days. I hope it's something sensible and in the middle here.
What is sensible to you? What would you say?
I don't know. I would have to take a look at what the interests are. I mean, you've got sheriffs, you've got federal law enforcement, and then you've got some other interests. We'll find out pretty soon what they have.
It can't be good for these different agencies not to be able to talk to each other.
No, I agree. I hope we can work something out here. I think we probably will.
Okay. Any other big things? We got just a couple seconds left.
I don't think
The Jeff Jackson Message, you've been great. Really appreciate you coming in. And thank you for joining us tonight. We want to remind you that if you prefer to get this show as a podcast, so you can listen either in your car or anywhere you'd like, you can find us wherever you get podcasts by searching Swing State. We'll see you next time.